can the evidence be so limited in its application as only to prove that the four Gospels were fully accepted in their day? Irenaeus not merely invests these documents with entire authority in the citations which he makes to overthrow the Gnostic heretics. It even appears in his work that the Gospels, or rather, to use his own expression, the fourfoldness of the Gospel, has been conformed to the analogy of the four quarters of the globe, the four chief winds, the four faces of the cherubim. He asserts that the four Gospels are the four pillars on which the Church rests, as it covers the whole earth, and in the number of four recognized a special token of the Creator's wisdom. Is such a representation compatible with the facts that at the time of Irenaeus the four Gospels first began to be accepted, or that an attempt was then being made to append a fourth and newer one to the three older ones then current? Is it not much more credible that the acceptance of all the four was then of so long standing and so thoroughly complete that the Bishop of Lyons could allude to the fourfoldness of the Gospel as a thing universally recognized, and in consequence of this very recognition speak of it as a thing which harmonizes with great and unchanging cosmical relations? Irenaeus died in the second year after the close of the 2nd century, but in his youth he had sat at the feet of the venerable Polycarp, who had been a disciple of John the Evangelist, and had been acquainted with many eyewitnesses of Jesus' life. In mentioning this fact, Irenaeus alludes very tenderly to the statement of his teacher Polycarp, that all that he had heard from the lips of John and other disciples of Jesus coincided fully with the written account. Yet let us hear his own words, and given in a letter to Florinus: I saw you while I was yet a youth in Lower Asia with Polycarp, when you were living in the scenes of princely splendor, and when you were striving to gain the approval of Polycarp. What took place then is fresher in my memory than what has occurred more recently. What we took in our youth grows up, as it were, with us, and is incorporated in us, and as such even now bring back to mind just the place where the good Polycarp used to sit, when he talked to us, how he looked as he came in and as he went out, and how as he lived, how he used to speak to the people, how he used to allude to his intercourse with John and repeat the words of the others who had seen the Lord, or how he used to recount what he had heard from their own lips about the miracles and the teachings of the Lord, and all in full accordance with the written narrative. Thus writes Irenaeus respecting his intercourse with Polycarp, and respecting the communication of Polycarp. The date of the young Irenaeus' intercourse with the agreed saint must be set approximately at about the year 150 AD. Irenaeus died in 202 AD, according to old accounts, a martyr, while Polycarp perished at the stake in 165 AD, after having, quote, to use his own expression, quote, served the Lord 86 years, end of quote. Is it to be believed that Irenaeus never heard from his teacher, whose communications respecting John he expressively refers to, one word regarding the Gospel of John? Indisputably, one part of Polycarp's testimony relative to John's Gospel carries us back to John himself. Just having a little rest here for a second. But Polycarp's evidence respecting the work of his teacher must be based upon the testimony of his teacher. The case becomes all the more clear the more closely we look into it on the adversary's side and range ourselves with those who deny the validity of John's Gospel. According to this view, Polycarp, although saying so much to Irenaeus regarding John, did not drop a word regarding the Gospel of John. But supposing he did not, is it credible that Irenaeus fully accepted that Gospel, that work which seemed to be the noblest gift of John to Christianity, the report of an eyewitness respecting the life, death, and resurrection of the Saviour of the world, as a Gospel which ran directly countered the testimony of the three other evangelists? Would not the very circumstances that Polycarp made no mention of it have convinced Irenaeus of its want of authenticity? And yet it is asserted that in order to meet and overthrow false teachers and the men who falsified the canon, he did not hesitate to reckon the Gospel of John strictly embracing among the sacred books. This on which I am now laying stress is nothing new. It has long stood recorded on those pages of Irenaeus. It has long been read there, but it has not had its due weight. Else how could it have been so lightly passed over. For my own part, I must completely justify the assigning of much greater weight on the part of correct and thorough investigators to the testimony of Polycarp and Irenaeus respecting the Gospel of John, than to all the difficulties and all the objections urged by skeptical scholars. And is the case not similar with Tertullian and his testimony respecting the Gospel? This man, who had been transformed from a worldly heathen lawyer into a powerful advocate of divine truth, enters so critically into the question of the origin and relative value of the four Gospels as expressly to subordinate Mark, Luke to Matthew and John on the ground that the former were mere helpers and companions of the apostles, while the later were selected by the Lord himself and invested with full authority. The same author propounds also an inexpugnable canon of historical criticism, a test of truth of the early Christian documents, and especially those of apostolic origin, in that he makes the value of testimony dependent on the epoch of the witness, and demands that what was held as true in his day should be judged in the light of its prior acceptance. If it has been accepted before, it was fair to suppose that it had been equally accepted in the time of the apostles. Its authenticity must therefore have been admitted by the apostolical church, founded as it was by the apostles themselves. And is it to be believed that this acute man was capable of being deceived in his acceptance of the Gospels and in his defense of them by anything web of sophistry or touch of charlatanism? The passages just referred to are taken from his celebrated reply to Marcion, who in wanton and heretical spirit had impugned the authenticity of the Gospels. 3 of the 4 he had only excluded, and of the 4 he retained only just so much as it pleased him to do. In reply to him, Tertullian expressly based his argument on the ground that at the time when the Apostolic Church was founded, all the 4 Gospels were accredited. Has such a statement no weight in the mouth of a man like Tertullian, when he wrote scarcely 100 years had elapsed since the death of John? And that date the testimony appealed to by him of the church at Ephesus, in which John had laboured so long, and amid which had died, must have been full and decisive respecting the genuineness or spurious of John's Gospel. Nor was it a matter of any difficulty to ascertain what was the judgment which this church passed on the Gospel. And we must not overlook the fact that we have not to do in this matter with a scholar who is contenting himself with merely learned investigations, but with a man full of earnestness respecting his faith and taking very seriously the question of human salvation. The Christian documents which asserted a connection between themselves and the origin of the new faith, the documents which all the worldly wisdom of the time in which Tertullian himself was reared took offence, were they likely to be accepted by him without inquiry and in a blind credulity? And inasmuch as he expressly assures us that he bases his acceptation of all the 4 Gospels on the credit of the Apostolic Church, is it not unworthy suspicion the doubting that he made through inquiry into the capacity of the Apostolic Church to pass on an authentic judgment on the Christian documents? End of quote. I'll just reflect on what he said here and tell you my thoughts about this. Basically, what he's saying, you've got all these esoteric modern scholars of his day saying that we've got to get under the Gospels, and what the church is telling us is not true. The Gospels are of later antiquity, a later date. They're not actually decent historical source material. They don't go to the 1st century. They're probably all 2nd century documents. These are the kind of ideas that were being spouted at the time of Tischendorf. What Tischendorf does is just go to the historical documents. He goes to the historical information, things that scholars already knew but just overlooked and didn't give them the weight that they deserved. So he goes to Irenaeus, ancient apostolic father, and he notices in Irenaeus' writing that he's quoting the 4 Gospels and that he says the 4 Gospels are like the 4 corners of the earth. And what he's saying is, look, this is just really good historical information that we're getting here, and we're just pushing it aside. And if we listen to this historical information, it's telling us the Gospels were not 1st century but 2nd century, not only 2nd century, but written by the people that we believe they were written by. And then he goes on to Tertullian, who is combating Marcion, who denied some of the Gospels because they were Jewish, and anything Jewish Irenaeus, Marcion did not want in his canon. So Tertullian is combating this, and Tertullian is quite clearly making it clear that there are 4 Gospels. So again, what Tischendorf is saying is this is just brilliant historical information to confirm that the 4 Gospels were written in the 1st century and were written by the people they were written by. And I think he's correct. And I think there has been a witch hunt by modern scholarship over the last 150 years against Irenaeus and Tertullian, not really wanted to give full weight to this kind of, to these people. That's me. Back to Tischendorf. He says, I insist therefore to sum up the matter that the testimony of Irenaeus and Tertullian respecting the 4 Gospels is not to be taken as an isolated, unrelated fact, but it must be considered as a valid result of all the historical evidence which was at their command. And how far we are justified in this is shown not only by the authorities already adduced, the author of the Muratori list of New Testament books, the African translators of the Gospels into Latin, and the originator of the Atala, but by all the other witnesses who lived prior to the time of Irenaeus and Tertullian. Many of my readers are acquainted with the so-called harmonies of the Gospels, the works in which the 4 sacred narratives are coordinated into a single one. In this way, an effort has been made to draw the Gospels alone to as closely followed and faithful portrait of our Lord's life, those points which one narrator has brought more prominently into view than the others being employed as supplementary to the other accounts, and a complete picture being the result. In these works, the narrative of John has been drawn upon to supply the incidents occurring in the last 3 years of Jesus' life, and to follow his course step by step. Harmonies of this kind were prepared as early as 170 AD by 2 men whose names are known to us. One of them was Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch in Syria, and the other was Tatian, a disciple of Justin, the great theologian and martyr. True, both of those works are lost, but Jerome speaks in the 4th century of the one prepared by Theophilus as still existing, describing it as a combination of the 4 Gospels in one continuous narrative. Respecting the second, we have the testimony of Eusebius and Theodoret, the later of whom speaks